Hi, this is Joe Park, CEO of Horizons Stewardship. And this morning I've got with me Jeff Watson. Jeff is an attorney that we've invited to come help us understand the provisions in the CARES Act that apply to our churches, to pastors, and frankly, much of this is also going to apply to small businesses. So if you're listening to this, you may want to share this recording with some of your financial leaders, small business owners in your church. Jeff, thank you for being with us today.
Joe, it's my pleasure.
Terrific. Jeff, why don't we begin by you sharing a little bit about yourself, how you came to be in this chair today?
It goes back to one of the strategists with Horizons, a dear friend of mine by the name of Tom Melzoni. He and I have a 15-year relationship where at the beginning of that, he was just instrumental in me letting God change my life.
Well, Tom, great shout out to you this morning. Thank you for arranging for Jeff to be here. So, Jeff, tell us a little bit about your professional background. Why do church leaders want to be listening to you today?
Sure, there's a litany of reasons. Number one, I've been in law practice now for 30 years. Number two, the majority of my practice is on small business owners. Number three, I've been active in my church for over 30 years, various leadership and board responsibilities, different financial situations, and so on. Next is I have for the last 10 years included in my practice work in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill relative to legislation, how it's drafted, how it's then pushed through the House, how it's through the Senate. And I've been pretty successful in my legal career, been able to change the law in the state of Ohio 4 times through litigation, once through legislation, been able to change federal housing policy twice through lobbying efforts, currently working on some legislation that I helped draft. I understand how this stuff is written. I read it as part of my day-to-day routine. And I've spent about 25 hours in the last 4 days reading just the first 80 pages of the CARES Act.
I appreciate your preparation for this today. So our listeners are primarily church pastors and church leaders, and they want to know first, does the CARES Act apply to them, and what is available to help their church in this moment?
The CARES Act applies to both churches because it specifically talks about tax-exempt organizations, and it also applies to pastors or other ministers that are self-employed. It applies to any organization that has 500 or fewer employees, that has a taxpayer identification number that indicates it has employees, either through a self-employment basis or because they file payroll reporting for their employees. It's a very broad application.
So if I'm a church with less than 500 employees.
Employees, not members, employees.
Right. So that would be a pretty big church. We have
Yeah.
an opportunity to borrow funds under the CARES Act. So tell us how we go about doing that.
Great question, because right now as we're talking, this bill has barely been enacted, okay? So we're right on the front edge of this. The first thing that they need to do is get their own records in order. And we'll talk in detail about the records that they need in just a minute. But they need to get their records in order. Who are they paid for payroll? Who have they paid for 1099s for all of 2019 and for the first 3 months of 2020? The second thing they need to do is find out which banks in their area are already approved SBA lenders. I recommend, because I think there's going to be a mass application for this and because time is critical, go to an existing SBA lender already and say, I want to apply for the Payroll Protection Act loan under the CARES Act. It's a 7A loan, and have your stuff together. And we'll talk about the stuff that they need in just a minute, but get after it right away. Get your stuff together, payroll information, and contact your closest SBA lender. And be persistent on doing that.
So, Jeff, what are the benefits that a church could receive under a loan?
Okay, so there's two benefits that I see to this. And first of all, the idea of churches borrowing money is, there's a lot of controversy about it. And the only reason I'm really into this is because of the second benefit that we'll get to. The first benefit is this loan can be quickly obtained without all the other exhaustive hoop jumping stuff that is so typical of the SBA. The second thing is when you do this loan correctly and you use it for the intended purposes, the money that you have borrowed is forgivable. It does not need to be repaid, and there is no tax consequences for forgiveness of debt income or a 1099-C, as we can geek out over. It's not there. If you borrow this money, if you use it for payroll, if you use it for the other few things that the statute says you can do, and you can prove it, and you do this all by the end of June, then those expenditures of that borrowed money are forgivable and do not need to be repaid. And the interest goes away as well.
So Jeff, what happens to the portion that isn't forgivable? Maybe the funds were spent in a different way. What happens then?
The funds that are not forgivable then have to be paid back over a 10-year period of time with an interest rate of 4% or less on them. So we're looking at something that's very, very easy to handle, particularly if you do the forgivable part and you get 80–90% of that money forgiven. You're down to a very small amount that you should be able to quickly get rid of by paying it off very quickly. But the thing that really, the thing that really gets me invigorated on this, why I spent so much time reading this and diligently studying it, was examining what do we have to do to have it forgiven? Because then in my eyes, the way I read the code, yes, it's an SBA loan, but it really looks like a grant. And that makes me feel a lot more comfortable going after the money.
So housing allowances are a big question in the calculation. We know that pastors have taken part of their compensation package and assigned that to housing allowance, utilities, different parts and pieces. I know there's not specifics in the law that speak directly to that. There may be as the SBA puts out guidance, but what is your best guess as to what this is going to look like?
I'm going to give you not my best guess. I'm going to give you my opinion because I'm going to pull up the portion of the code and I'm going to read it to you, okay? Because this is the way I am. I read the actual language in the law. And here it comes, okay? And I'm at the very beginning, page 10 of 880 some pages. And in the middle of page 10, it says the term payroll costs means the sums of payments of any compensation with respect to employees, that is salary, wage, commission, or other similar compensation. B, payment of cash, tips, or equivalent. So when I see any compensation or similar compensation, I think housing allowance is clearly part of a pastor's reasonable compensation package, and it's included. Now, to be thorough, as part of your loan application, delineate, hey, this is how much we paid this way, this is how much we paid this way, this is how much we paid over here. So it's all there up front. So when you submit the documentation as part of your loan, and it really looks like you're going to submit most of this when you're applying for the forgiveness portion rather than actually getting the money, but we'll get into that.
All right. So I'm a pastor. I've just heard this applies to me.
It does.
I've heard that this loan is calculated on 2.5 months of expenditures.
Okay. It's calculated on 2.5 times the average of the monthly expenditures for payroll and compensation, et cetera, in the year prior. Yes.
And I've heard that if I spend those funds on payroll, interest on loans, and a few other qualifying areas, that this could be really a grant, a forgiven loan, that has no other reporting requirements. If I'm a small business, there's not even tax on the forgiveness side of this. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Tell
This,
me.
this is why I spent so much time, Joe, reading the actual code, because I don't trust what I hear on the news media. I don't trust what I read in social media. I don't trust what other people always tell me. I want to read and verify myself, you know, a little bit like a Berean, you know, reference to the New Testament there. I'm going to read it for myself.
Absolutely. So I've just heard you say this. I'm excited. What are my next steps? What do I need to be doing to prepare my church? What do my church leaders need to be doing to prepare themselves for this loan?
First thing you need to do is get access to all of your 2019 payroll compensation expenditures. Who did you 1099? Who did you cut paychecks to? Who did you pay housing allowance to? You need to know who all of those people are and how much you paid. You need to know how much you paid every month. I don't need to know how much went to each person each month. I need to know how much went out each month. Okay? Some of it for 1099 purposes, they're going to just take it and divide it by 12 and use it on an average basis. But they're going to pay attention to what you paid in payroll, particularly in the months of March of 2019 until now. They're going to add all that up. They're going to divide it by 12. They're going to take that number and multiply it times 2.5, and that's your loan amount.
Now, I've heard there is a restriction of $100,000 per individual. Talk to us about that. Help us understand how that's calculated.
Excellent question. So on individuals, and I know there's some churches out there that are able to bless and compensate their pastors in excess of $100,000. So only the first 100,000 paid to that pastor will get included in that calculation.
So we don't exclude someone whose total comp is over 100. We can only include the first $100,000 of compensation
Correct.
in the loan application.
Correct. And then the other part where that comes into play is for expenditures that are forgiven, that same highly compensated person or pastor can only, during the period of time that we're talking about, April, May, June, they can only receive an average of about $8,333.33 per month in compensation in order for that to be forgivable.
So if they are paid more than that,
then what extra
happens?
They're paid over and above is not forgiven.
So you can compensate more than 100,000, you just can't deduct it as forgivable.
Right. You can't claim it or seek forgiveness of that amount. So for example, if a pastor is getting paid, let's just say $10,000 a month, $120,000 a year, okay, which given how hard they work, that's really not enough.
I can hear the clapping in the background from pastors out there of all sizes.
Well, you know, I know how hard my friends in the ministry, whether it's my buddy Tim Campbell down in Lakeland, Florida, or whether it's Bill McMahon or Steve Arslick or some of the other guys at my home church, I know how hard they work, okay? So, you know, by the way, you know, serendipitous shouts out to those guys because I respect them immensely. What they receive above $8,333.33 is not going to be forgiven. But the first $8,333 that they receive for April, May, and June that's paid from these borrowed proceeds, and you can prove that you made the payment with the borrowed proceeds, yes, then you're good. They can claim that for their forgiveness.
So, Jeff, what I heard you say is that churches need to calculate what they have spent in payroll. That will allow them to be prepared to apply for this loan. They need to identify an SBA approved lender to expedite this. If your banker is not an approved SBA lender, is there a provision that they might become? And what would be the consequences awaiting?
Great questions. Great questions. Yes, there's provisions in the code that expand how many more banks can apply and become. I am not sure how fast this $349 billion is going to go, how quickly people are going to apply for it. So let me get this into perspective. When this piece of legislation was enacted, or before this legislation was enacted, this particular loan program had about $30 billion allocated to it. So Congress took that 30 billion, which that's a mind-boggling sum, and they 11x'd it. They went from 30 to 349 billion, just in the amount that can be lent. So that's an 11x. I don't know how fast that money is going to go, because everybody that I'm talking to, because this has been my focus now for like 6 days, I've been eating, sleeping, and drinking this stuff. Everybody I'm talking to is lining up to go get it, because they see how it is important to keep their businesses running, keep their churches running, pay their staff, keep their people fed. But they also see that if they do this the right way, they can have the loan proceeds forgiven.
So Jeff, what's different about this 7A SBA loan compared to other kinds of loans as you've seen, or even 7A loans before this point? What's different?
Oh, I don't think we have enough time to talk about all of the subtle differences, but let me just give the massive level. The expedited simplicity of this. For you to apply for this loan, you have to have 3 things. You have to have a taxpayer identification number already in existence showing that you have that was used for making payments to individuals for work, okay? Whether you're a 1099 self-employed filing under your social security number, or whether you're a sub-S corporation, whether you're a church, whatever it is. That's the first thing you got to have. The second thing you have to have is you have to have your payroll records, so that they can do the calculation. They can add up, do the averaging, and multiply times 2.5. The third thing that you have to have, and this isn't the thing people ought to talk about, but they need to, is you have to prove that you were in business on February 15th of 2020. Now, if my memory serves me right, that was a weekend, okay? Valentine's Day fell on a Friday. Saturday was the 15th. So if your doors were open that weekend, Saturday night service, Sunday services, you got a church bulletin from them, you've got proof off of a website, you've got an audio recording, whatever it is that you got to have, screenshots, all that stuff of your sermon, your ministry, bang, you've got it. You've got that proof to be able to, and they have to be able to presume that you were impacted by the coronavirus. And so how can you prove you're impacted by the coronavirus? Hey, listen, if you've got a congregation that can't meet together, can't tithe, can't give, can't worship, how does it impact the church's financials? You know, even an atheist has got to concede that.
So Jeff, as these churches get their information together, they identify a potential lender. What does the application process look like, or what do you imagine it will look like?
Oh, man, I do not yet know, because as of before banking hours began this morning, I was on my own bank's small business portal trying to find it, and it wasn't there yet. I suspect that they are going to create some sort of an online portal. And this is an important point. I want everybody to listen carefully. There should be some sort of an online portal for this. What it will look like, I don't know. But when I talk about online portals, I want to be clear, because we are not talking about disaster relief loans. Okay? Disaster relief loans are 7B loans. The window to apply for them shuts down tomorrow night. There's portals, there's links out there for now, and I already seen some of the trade groups that consult with me that there's confusion between the two, 7B, 7A, access and application. Pastors, don't do that. What you want to do is you want to be daily monitoring your bank. You want to be reaching out. If you've got a relationship with the branch manager, call that branch manager. Hey, who's your SBA rep? How can I get an appointment to talk to them? When can I talk to them? What's their number? What's their email?
So that sounds important. There is a little confusion. I've had people tell me they've already applied online, and what they've applied for is an SBA disaster loan. If you have already applied for an SBA disaster loan, are you also able to apply for a CARES Act loan?
No, you cannot. They are exclusive of each other. The statute's very clear. You can't do both. You can do one or the other. So I have one client that owns two different businesses. One of them is a very seasonal business. So his payroll is incredibly light this time of the year. So it's not going to be good numbers for him. The other business payroll is consistent. So he's doing the disaster loan on the seasonal business, and he's doing the payroll protection loan on the business with a level or consistent payroll. And that's where churches should be. Churches should be in the same area. Their payroll should be pretty consistent. I realize they're growing, but it's not massive chunks and so on. So that should be the best way for them to go.
So Jeff, in that 888 pages, there's a lot of information. What information has yet to be developed? I understand there's guidance coming from the Treasury. The SBA has been given 30 days to develop their guidelines. What are you understanding? You work in Washington, you do lobbying, you help with legislation. What do you expect to happen?
I expect this to happen. I expect there to be an easy way in to get the money, but I expect the loan forgiveness to be a bit tedious. And so it's important to have great record keeping from the beginning. So let me give you a strategy that I've talked about with a couple of other really smart minds in the accounting space on this one. When you borrow these funds and you receive them, put them into a new, separate, distinct bank account. Only move that money for expenditure purposes to match the actual checks that you're cutting. And I still would use paper checks, folks. I realize we live in a digital world, but in this case, I want paper checks because the paper check is going to be my conclusive proof of this much money went to this particular purpose on this date in this amount. So if it's going to rent, if it's going to the interest portion on a payment, if it's going to pay payroll, if it's going to pay things like that, that's where I want. If it's going to pay for healthcare benefits, if you're paying for your staff's insurance, if the church is paying for the insurance for a pastor, that's included. So those are things that you can spend the money on. But track it carefully. You've got to be able to prove. Expect that you're going to have the equivalent of an IRS audit on this. Be prepared for that and you'll be great.
Jeff, most of our churches are using electronic payroll deposits. Are you saying they should try to get off of that? There are third-party processors involved in it, or will
if they've got a third-party processor? I'm sorry to talk over you like that, Joe. If they've got a third-party processor, show that that money came out of that new account to the third-party processor for the exact amount of what those checks are going to be cut for. Okay?
Terrific. So, Jeff, there's a lot of talking heads on television and the media all over the internet that are giving advice. Speaking to pastors, who would you have them taking advice from? You're a licensed attorney, licensed to give advice. Speak to that.
Sure. So this is the time where you have to really double down on your trusted resources. So Horizon has been there for decades. Trust the people that have been there for decades. I would not be paying attention to all the talking heads. I would definitely not be getting my information off of social media. I would be doing three things. I'd be going to people who have either read the bill, people who have either worked and already done this before, or people who have got specific things, such as go to your bank's website. What does it say about SBA? Read it there. Contact the SBA. What does it say there? And they're on a huge learning curve. They're on a massive learning curve right now. I can imagine that they've been digesting this information yesterday and today, and they're going to be on a massive learning curve. So be patient with them a little bit. But you want to go to somebody who either has clearly read the code. You yourself, pastor, you can read the code. I mean, I'll tell you, in my opinion, it's easier to read this than it is to read certain sections of Leviticus. But anyhow, it's just, just the way I am. But read it for yourself. The first 80 pages is what really matters. Read it for yourself. and you'll figure out that it's really something that you can use and benefit your staff, your congregation, and yourself. Joe, I don't know what else to tell you there, because just because somebody sounds like they know what they're talking about, maybe they have, maybe they haven't. I mean, I wouldn't be doing this with you if I didn't have a track record of already having done this. Do you know what I mean?
I do. I do. For anyone who would like to read the entire bill in the Resilient Leadership Series 4, we put a link to the entire 880 pages. You can go there and do that. At Horizons, we are not licensed to give legal or accounting or tax advice. So this is why we're inviting persons who are. We encourage you to listen to your licensed counsel, your CPA, and attorneys in the church. But I've heard Jeff say maybe even one step further, make sure that they have experience in these areas and are not just licensed to speak to them. Jeff, it has been terrific having you on today. What would you like to share with pastors, church leaders that we haven't talked about?
God, let me get the words out right. Please, Lord. Okay. What time I'm afraid, I will trust in thee. I think it's Psalm 56:3 or 65:3. I sometimes turn that first two numbers around. We have all heard Psalm 23, Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. This is a time where the church has to be engaged. So men, ladies, if you can confidently look at your staff, look at your team and go, hey, with this particular payroll protection loan, we're going to be good for payroll and salaries for the next few months. Therefore, you don't have to worry about it. Therefore, you can minister to the congregation and encourage them and enable them and equip your congregations to go out and minister to those who are not part of your congregation, to those who need to have a relationship with Jesus Christ, those whose faith might be weak, those who don't have any faith yet. Focus on helping them, because this is where our faith gets a chance to really display and shine. Are we relevant? Can we truly be salt and light at this time?
Jeff, this has been incredibly helpful. There are going to be more questions that come up. Would you be willing to come back and share with us again another time?
I'd be happy to do that again. It would be a tremendous privilege and honor to do that. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Because I know the impact that Horizons has continued to have in my life, and I'm just grateful for it. So a chance to share back a little bit would be great.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.